In this module, we're going to discuss the threat prevention, configuring your on-access and on-demand scanners. The module goals for this module are that we're going to look at the on-access and on-demand scanning. These are the key components of the endpoint security threat prevention module. All your other components has to do with the access protection, our quarantine manager, the detection of potentially unwanted programs. But this one is where we have, when somebody accesses a file, what does the ENS scanner on-access scan do? Also, how do I go in and configure our on-demand scan? So we're going to identify the different types of scanners that ENS provides. We're going to explain how the on-access and on-demand scanners work. And we'll configure the on-access and on-demand scanner settings to meet your needs. In the scanning overview, understand that the threat prevention module includes two different types of scanners. The on-access scanner integrates with your system at the lowest levels, like your file system driver, and scans the files where they're accessed on your system. The on-access scanner will examine the files on the computer as the user accesses them, providing continuous real-time detection of threats. Or it may not be the user that's accessing the files, it may be the system. The on-access scanner will deliver your notifications to our service interface when the detections occur. You can configure where this does not pop up. The on-access protection and the exploit prevention feature also examines the files as the user accesses them, providing continuous real-time detection of access violations and buffer overflow exploits. The on-demand scanner is initiated manually, or you can have a scheduled scan. We have now 3 predefined on-demand scans. You have the full scan, the quick scan, and the right-click scan. The key features on the on-access scan is the fact that it utilizes our McAfee Global Threat Intelligence integration so that we use heuristics to check for suspicious files. So if the DATs are not already detecting them, the Global Threat Intelligence can help on that detection. You also have the threat detection user messaging, where you can have a pop-up where it will have a specified message when the detection occurs. You also have the process settings, where I can allow same or different settings depending on the processes that are listed for high or low risk. We also have the script scan, which scans any JavaScript or VBS script to prevent any unwanted scripts from executing on your system. It also allows you to specify some exclusions by the URL for the script scan. All of the common scan settings are defined in the ENS common policy. This figure will illustrate how the on-access scanner works at a very high level. If we have it where you've configured it where it says let McAfee decide, the on-access scanner will use a trust logic to optimize the scanning. This logic will improve our security in scanning and boost the performance by avoiding any unnecessary scans. So for example, if the scanner determines that the program has not been tampered with, then it might do a reduced or optimized scanning. So let's say you went to access the file. You were going to read the file. So the on-access scanner examines the file. It looks to see if the scan criteria is met. If it's yes, then it's going to compare the file to any of the signatures in the security content. If there's any matching signature, then it denies whatever the action is. If you said try to clean it, it tries to clean it. If it cannot clean it, then you have selected delete and it will do that action. And then it will cache the result. If you do not have any matching signatures and it feels that this is a suspicious file, it will query GTI. Whatever the response it gets back from GTI, it will do the configured action and then once again cache the result. If the scan criteria was not met, then the scanner will grant the operation and cache the file. In the threat prevention on-access scan policies, this time we actually have 3 pre-configured policies. Once again, you have the McAfee default, which is read-only. We have the My Default, which you can edit, which is a duplicate of the McAfee default. And now we also have this on-access scan for Exchange. It's also a read-only policy, and this policy is configured with the most common exclusions if you have the ENS product installed on a Microsoft Exchange server. The settings that the on-access scan for Exchange has is that it contains these certain low-risk processes that has to do with your Exchange server. It automatically has some exclusions that are listed for the Exchange server. If you don't have this policy applied, then you may have to create your own Exchange policy and add your own exclusions. But be sure that you look at the KB article of KB 51471. Also, you may want to look at the KB article of KB 66909 for all of our consolidated lists of the exclusion guidelines for email and other products. In continuation of the on-access scan for Exchange policy, we automatically have the Exchange exclusions that are defined for you. If you'll notice, there's lots of the wildcards that we mentioned to you before, and you can actually go in and validate as to whether or not these exclusions actually apply to your Exchange server. To look at the basic settings of the on-access scan, we'll look at what's enabled by default and what's disabled by default. First off, enabling the on-access scan is enabled by default, and we do recommend that you keep that enabled, otherwise the ENS scanner is not going to be scanning. The enable on-access scan on system startup, basically every time you reboot the machine, it'll make sure that the on-access scanner is started by default. You do want to keep that enabled by default. The specify maximum number of seconds for each file scan. This limits each file to a scan time of a certain amount of seconds. It is enabled and it is always set to 45 seconds by default. Basically, if a scan takes longer than 45 seconds, the scan will stop cleanly and it will log a message. So what you'll see on your EPO server is a message that will say scan timed out. It is recommended that you look at this information and determine why is it having a scan timed out on that particular file, and maybe you might want to create more exclusions or look at maybe increasing the scan timed out. The scan boot sectors basically will examine any of your boot sector that's on your disk. It is enabled by default, but if you have a disk that contains a unique or abnormal boot sector that cannot be scanned, you can disable this boot sector scanning. The scan processes on server startup and content update. It will rescan all the processes that are currently in the memory each time. On-access scans are re-enabled when you have the contents files updated, or when the system starts, or the mcshield.exe process starts. This is disabled by default. Some programs or executables will start automatically when on the system startup, so enabling this option can actually slow down your system and increase the startup time. The Scan Trusted Installers will scan any MSI files that are installed by MSI.exe and any files that are signed by McAfee or Microsoft, or if you had a Windows Trusted Installer service files. This is disabled by default. The idea is to keep this disabled to improve the performance of large Microsoft application installers. If you have this enabled and you go to install a large application, it will actually slow down the installation process and make it probably very difficult for you to use. We have a new feature that comes with this product, and it's scan when copying between local folders. The idea of this is if a user went to copy a file from one folder to another, what it's going to do is it's going to look at the file as it reads it, and it's also going to look at the file when it writes it. So it's disabled by default. By default, what it will do is it will scan upon the write. Okay? So the idea is if you do have this enabled, you're going to actually affect more performance on your machine. To understand how ENS on-access scanner handles your client-side caching interactions is just to understand Microsoft has that offline files, folders technology, or a client-side caching. This allows for files that are hosted on a remote resource to be locally accessible by a device when that device is not connected to the network. This function is called client-side caching because Windows creates a local copy of the file within a protected folder. From that folder, the device can read and modify the file's content as needed. Then when your device is again connected to the network, the remote file is accessible and any changes that they made to that local file will be synchronized to both copies. The file being cached in this manner is always considered a remote file, even when the device is disconnected from the network. The user or the programs accessing the file use the same remote location. It is Windows that handles the necessary redirection that provides access to that cached local copy. Because the file is always considered remote, for the on-access scan to scan these files, the network drive scanning feature must be enabled. Also, the same thing with your on-demand scanner to scan offline files, it must be provided with the original remote location to do that scan. How McAfee's GTI helps in our scan is it is enabled and the default is medium sensitivity. So the higher that you set the sensitivity level, the higher number of malware detections that we're going to receive. So this might be where you will get a lot more false positives. So what you want to think about, which setting do you want to use? The idea is possibly just stay with medium unless, as you see here, you might want to have very high selected if you're scanning volumes and directories that do not support executing programs or operating systems. Otherwise, I can go with high, where I have some people who, they're always infected all the time. I get a lot of queries, everything on that computer. So I'll just make them high. But once again, the medium is your regular risk of exposure to malware is greater than my risk of false positives. Otherwise, I can be very low or low, because basically with those, maybe I have, where the systems are a little more controlled, I have a stronger security footprint, and I can actually prevent people from accessing certain types of files just by their own user access. The on-access scan feature to show a message is enabled, and we have a predefined message that is the default that you can use. When you have this enabled, a message will display whenever there is a detection that occurs. So what happens is this will pop up, and the user can open this page from their Scan Now page at any time when they want to see the detection list. The detection list will include at least one threat. This detection list will be cleared anytime the service restarts or the system reboots. This message box will specify what message you want to display when the users have this detection. You may actually want to turn this off because this can be very disruptive to the end user whenever it has the pop-up. The on-access scan feature for the process settings is now the feature where we can go in and say, do I want to use the same settings for all processes, or do I want to do different settings for the different processes? So I can go in and configure different treatment based on the possibility of a process spreading or introducing my potential threats. And in getting ready for the different settings for the low risk or high risk, if you want to decide that I want to have more than one scanning policy, think about these guidelines. Identify your processes. You can use the Windows Task Manager or your Performance Monitor to determine which processes that are actually using all of your CPU and memory. Identify which program is responsible for each process. Remember that only the child processes of the defined parent process adhere to the scanning policy. For example, if you define the Microsoft Word executable file winword.exe as a high-risk process, any Microsoft documents that are accessed would be scanned according to the high-risk scanning policy. However, when the parent process Microsoft Word is launched, the WinWord.exe file is scanned according to the policy of the process that launched it. For example, Windows Explorer. You need to identify the risk that applies to each process using these guidelines. If it's low risk, that would be a lower possibility of spreading or introducing potential threats. Or you want to use a better performance on all of your trusted processes. You want it where it scans it only just one time when they enter the memory space, and a good example of this are any of the McAfee security products: Microsoft SQL Server, VMware Workstation, VMware Player. Your higher risk is where I have a higher possibility of spreading or introducing potential threats. They're scanned when they enter the memory, and again every time they access anything on the system. A good example of this is internet-facing social media. What's unlisted or not defined is the fact that you'll have a standard setting for all the processes that are not defined as high risk or low risk. In configuring the low risk or high risk processes, you can go into the process settings, select configure different settings for high risk and low risk. Then what you'll do is you click the add button, you put in the process name, and then you put whether or not it is high risk or low risk, and then you save that. To configure the when to scan for standard, high risk, and low risk, now instead of having 3 separate policies, what we have is everything's configured within one policy, and you have 3 tabs. So you click on the different tabs for standard, high risk, and low risk, and then you can make the necessary settings for what you want. For the standard, the default setting is let McAfee decide. What you have with that is that allows McAfee to decide whether the file must be scanned, and this optimizes the scanning. The McAfee decide uses this trust logic to optimize the scanning. It improves our security and boosts performance by avoiding any unnecessary scans. For example, McAfee analyzes and considers some programs to be trustworthy. If McAfee verifies that these programs have not been tampered with, the scanner might perform reduced or optimized scanning. The trust logic improves security and boosts performance by avoiding unnecessary scans. For more information about this technology, see the document Understanding the McAfee Endpoint Security 10 Threat Prevention Module white paper at our website. Okay. For more information about the AM Core Trust module, also go to our website and look at our community website and look for the document that it's doc-8131. That attached document will include the AM Core technology overview, which explains at a very high level the purpose and somewhat the functionality of the scan avoidance feature. What we have is for high risk, it's also enabled for the let McAfee decide, and the low risk is enabled for let McAfee decide. To configure the what to scan feature for your standard high risk and low risk, your options are all files, which basically scans all the files regardless of the extension. This is our recommended setting. The failure to enable this option may leave your system unprotected from certain malware attacks. You can select the options for default and specified file types, which means it will only scan a default list of file extensions that are defined in the AM Core content file, including any files that do not have any extensions or any additional file extensions specified that you have done, and any known macro threats. The specified file types only, this feature, it will scan the files that are specified. You do a comma separated to separate the different extensions. All the files with no extension or both. It is not really recommended that you select these 2 options. We really recommend that you stay with the all files. We do have a list of KB articles that you can look at to see what are the list of the default file types. For Mac, you have KB84411. For Linux, KB79626. A continuation of the features to select for what to scan, we have on network drives, which scans resources on your map network drives. You might affect your performance, especially when it comes to the fact that you will be crossing the network to scan these network drives. You have the option to scan when open for backups, which when you have the backup software running, we will be scanning the files. This is not recommended. The compressed archive, if you'll notice, it's only enabled for the high risk. This will examine all the contents of any archived files, including any .jar files, and we only recommend that you really use this during off hours. The compressed MIME encoded files is disabled by default. This will detect and decode and scan any of the multipurpose internet mail extensions encoded files that you have on your system. It will also scan the Apple Mail messages on your Macintosh systems. Additional scan options that we have for the standard high risk and low risk. We have the section for detect unwanted programs. So this gives the ability for our scanner to let you detect any potentially unwanted programs, and it will use whatever configuration you did in the threat prevention settings. Detect unknown program threats. We have that enabled for the standard and the high risk, and if you'll notice for the low risk it is not enabled. This utilizes our GTI to detect any executables that have code that might resemble malware. The detect unknown macro threats, the same thing you have where it's disabled for the low risk, and again it uses the McAfee GTI to help detect any unknown macro viruses. On-access scan actions for standard high risk and low risk are as follows. First response is to try to clean it. We recommend that you have it where it tries to clean the files because it will pass it by the clean.dat file to see if it's cleanable. If it cannot be cleaned, then the second response would be delete the files. You do have the other options of deny access to files and to delete the files, but do understand that if you have the first response be to delete the files, that means it never even tries to see if it's cleanable. Down on the unwanted programs first response, notice that we have another option that you can have allow access to the files. Now technically the files are not really deleted. What happens is the files actually moved to the quarantine folder and it is password protected. We'll talk more about the options that happens with the quarantine folder later. To fine-tune your protection, we have the option of the exclusions. So you can actually create these exclusions so that the ENS product does not scan certain files or folders and file type or a file having to do with its age. And then when you do the exclude, you can say to exclude on read or exclude on write or both. We have a whole list of KB articles that gives you everything about all the different lists of our exclusions that you should have depending on what product is actually installed on your system. One of the things that I want to point out is the fact that all the wildcards are supported, but if you actually want to do a folder, you need to be sure that you put a backslash at the end of the name of the folder. Otherwise it will see it as a file name. The script scan for the on-access scanner is enabled by default, and what this does is it operates as a proxy component having to do with the Windows scripting host. So what happens is it basically, if I go to access a website and there's a script, it actually takes it and it first looks at the script before it allows it to execute. If the script is clean, then you're actually able to run the script. If it does have a potential threat, then we will prevent that script from executing. If you do have a lot of script-intensive websites and web-based applications that are running, they might experience a lot of poor performance when you have this enabled. So instead of disabling this, specify some URL exclusions for any of your trusted sites. Do note, on Windows Server 2008, the script scan URL exclusions do not work with Internet Explorer unless you enable the third-party browser extensions and restart this system. We have a KB article that you need to look at for that. So it's KB 69526. This figure illustrates at a very high level how the script scan works. So basically what happens is I go to access a web page. It has a script, and we first look to see if the script scan is enabled. If it's enabled, script scan will scan the script. If it's clean, then we have where the script is passed to the native Windows scripting host. If it's not clean, then it is prevented from executing. If we do not have the script scan enabled, then the script automatically executes. So the types of on-demand scans that comes with ENS is you have a full scan, a quick scan, and a right-click scan. And then we also have where you have the on-demand scan client tasks. So now what we do in the ENS is all the scan settings are configured in a policy. The client task will have to do with when do you want to schedule the scan. And you can have that at a regular interval or a specified time or a certain duration. This slide shows you a high-level view of how the on-demand scanner works. You have it where you have the schedule kicks in, the scanner starts scanning, he examines the file, it's the same thing. Is the scan criteria met? Yes, then he looks at the file to see if it matches any of the signatures and security content. If there's any matching signatures, then what is your configured action? If they're not, then he caches the result and checks the next file. If the scan criteria is not met, then the file is not examined and it will continue on to the next file till it has all of them scanned. The full scan and quick scan, you can actually initiate this manually from the ENS client interface, but what it will do is whatever the settings are for the full scan and the quick scan all has to do with how are they configured in the on-demand scan policy. So however you've configured this on EPO, even though the end user can open up the console locally, and if they click the scan now for one of those scans, it's going to do the scan according to your policy that it received by EPO. I do want to note that you cannot invoke or start an on-demand scan manually from the command line like you were able to do previously with the VirusScan Enterprise. Another type of scan that you can use is I can right-click a particular folder and I can do what we call the right-click scan, and this shows you an example of I selected the right-click, I have a pop-up, I can select scan for threats, and it will go in and it'll scan right then. Just understand it's not possible for you to set any exclusions for the right-click scan. Once you've configured the policy for your on-demand scan or the right-click scan or the full scan, you have where you can go into the client task catalog and you can see what are our options for the endpoint security threat prevention scans. If you will notice, we have two types listed in here. One says custom on-demand scan, which those are the types of scans that you can go in and create like you did the old way with VirusScan Enterprise, where you would customize all your settings within that particular client scan. The second type, policy-based on-demand scan, is obvious that what you do is that is based upon what do you have for your different settings in the policy. If you will notice, what we have is you have two on-demand scans configured by default. The duplicate is grayed out. This is because you cannot duplicate these. All you can do is assign it. When you assign it in the system tree, either to a system or your groups, that's when you configure what is the schedule that has to do with your on-demand scan, whether or not it being a full or a quick scan. Just understand, custom on-demand scans do not update in the endpoint security threat prevention product properties on the EPO server system details page. All you will see in there is the date of the last full scan and the date of the last quick scan in the properties, so you can actually see when did they actually go in and do the scans. We have a KB article, it's KB 86677, where it defines user-defined on-demand scan tasks do not update the date of last full scan or date of last quick scan in endpoint security threat prevention. To begin configuring the policies for these on-demand scan policies, once again, you go into the policy catalog and you select on-demand scan from the categories. You select either the McAfee default or the My Default. And if you recall, McAfee default is always read only. The options of what you can do within this policy are the fact that you have 3 tabs across the top. You have the full scan, the quick scan, the right-click scan. So basically, you can go in and you configure these settings so that when you have the scheduled scan, it will look at this and it will scan according to this policy. Just understand the different guidelines that we have are scan only what is necessary. So try to think of when you're scanning the files, what types are going to affect your system performance. So only use those options if you need to scan specific file types of certain files. Select or deselect any of these options in the What to Scan selection of the Custom On-Demand Scan Client Task settings. You also have the option of files that have been migrated to storage and also the compressed archive files. Otherwise, everything else is the same as the settings of the on-access scan. Do note, scanning compressed archive files can negatively affect your system performance. As a best practice, we do recommend you deselect that option to improve your system performance. In this table, we're continuing looking at what are the default settings for your full, quick, and right-click scan. If you'll notice, it's the same thing as detecting your unwanted programs, the unknown program threats, and the unknown macro threats. It's the same settings as what we had with the on-access scanner. The scan locations is what's the real big feature of being able to do this by the policy. Is you have the options of, do you want to scan memory for rootkits, your running processes, registered files, my computer, your all local drives, your all fixed drives, all removable drives, your map drives, your home folder, user's profile folder, Windows folder, your program files folder, your temp folder, recycle bin, or file or folders. So think about when you're selecting these locations, maybe what I need to do is focus on the fact that I don't want it to scan in all the map drives. So think about that I'm not doing everything when I'm doing my full scan. But the default settings are scan subfolders is enabled. The item for scanning the subfolders you have enabled for full and quick scan. The right-click scan, this feature does not apply. What this does is it's going to scan all the subfolders in that specified volume when we have that selected. The specified locations, we're going to look at the next page to see that, but otherwise it does not apply to the right-click scan. You have all the locations for that. So I can click Add and add a specific location for that to scan. Just understand, if you do not scan the memory for rootkits and the running processes, that can leave your system unprotected against malware attacks. On the section for the file types to scan, it's the same thing as what we have for the on-access scanner, but you configure the settings for full, quick scan, and right-click scan. Notice that it's all files is enabled for all 3 types of scannings, and all the files is always strongly recommended. On your on-demand scan, we still have the McAfee GTI feature available for the on-demand scan, and once again, as you notice, for all 3 types of scans it is enabled, and the default sensitivity level set for the scans is medium. So it's the same thing as configuring the on-access scan for the McAfee GTI. The exclusions for your on-demand scan can be set for the full, quick, and right-click scan. So you can actually go in and set these different exclusions. And once again, I can go in and utilize all the wildcards. It's the same feature as what we have for the on-access scanner. Just remember, we cannot really do any exclusions for the right-click scan. The options for the actions for the on-demand scan is the same thing that you have with the on-access scanner. You have the options for the continue scanning, clean files, and delete files. The unwanted programs is a little bit different because the only options for that is continue scanning clean files and delete files. The on-demand scan performance settings for our full scan, quick scan, and right-click scan is the fact that, first off, we can utilize the scan cache. Since the on-access scanner may have already been scanning, whatever it's put in the cache, we don't have to scan again. But basically, we can also say how much CPU will the scanner use during the scan. If I have systems that have a lot of end-user activity, you can set the system utilization to low. Just understand, if you set it to low, it's going to take it longer to do the on-demand scan. Now note that using the scan cache is disabled for the right-click scan. Otherwise, the system utilization is always below normal for all three types of scans. Other scheduled scan options that we have for the full and quick scan, if you'll notice this is not for the right-click scan, is the first one is scan only when the system is idle. This is where it will pause the scan the minute the user tries to access the system using the keyboard or the mouse. When they're not using the keyboard or mouse, then it will resume the scan when it is idle for up to 5 minutes. You can change how long the idle is. We do recommend that you disable this on server and systems that are being accessed using the remote desktop connection only. You have the feature of user can resume pause scans. You have scan anytime. So what that will do is it will run the scan even if the user is active, and it will specify the different options for that scan. The do not scan when the system is on battery power is a really good idea, because think about somebody who might be sitting on a plane, who might be doing some work, and they're not plugged into any power supplies and they have their battery only. You don't want the scan to suddenly kick in and eat up the battery while they're trying to get work done, while they're having to use the battery. We have an option for the full and quick scan only, where you can actually go in and enter the account for scanning any network devices. So I can put the credentials for that person that can be used while the task is running. If no credentials are specified, it will run as a local system administrator account. You can set your password, and you can also put the domain that has to do with that user account. We still have the option to be able to create your own custom on-demand scans that are not policy-based. The feature is that you can go in and create this task, and you can select all the different options just as if you did in your policy. But this is the way we did it in the VirusScan Enterprise, and you can still utilize possibly any VirusScan Enterprise on-demand scans that have been migrated over. But you have to have administrative rights to schedule the task. Check your understanding, fill in the blank. The on blank scanner examine files when they're touched by the system. Is that the on-access scan, or is that the on-demand scan? If you said on-access scan, then you are entirely correct. Check your understanding, true or false. By default, the on-access scanner uses different settings for high-risk and low-risk processes. True or false? If you answered false, that is correct. If you want to actually have it where it uses different settings for high risk and low risk, you must make that change and then select what is the high risk and low risk processes, along with how do you want it to scan and any exclusions that you want to configure. Check your understanding, true or false. Exclusions configured in EPO policy will overwrite the exclusions manually defined on the endpoint when a policy is enforced. This is true. Always remember, any policy that the McAfee agent downloads will always overwrite whatever local settings have been configured. The key points to remember is that, recall, McAfee GTI will use the heuristics to check for suspicious files. The higher your sensitivity level, the higher the number of detections. However, you might have a lot more false positives along with your higher number of detections. When configuring your on-access scan settings, you can use the same or different settings having to do with high risk, low risk, and standard risk processes. The script scan will scan your JavaScript and VB script to prevent any potentially unwanted scripts from executing on your system. The Lit McAfee Decide option improves the performance by avoiding any unnecessary scans. You can create exclusions to fine-tune your on-access and on-demand scan protection. The exclusions configured in the policies will overwrite the exclusions that were configured locally in the client interface.